Okay, welcome everyone to all of our LinkedIn folks that are joining us live, also to our YouTube folks that are joining us live. We are going to be watching comments on the LinkedIn side, so if you're on YouTube, if you want to jump over to LinkedIn and put comments or questions in there so that we can see them, that would be great. I'm going to do a quick intro of our topic. I'm going to introduce our guests, and then we're going to get right into it. So today's roundtable, we're going to dive into the essentials of building a company culture that not only fosters growth, but also drives accountability at every level. We know that most of the people here are executives in high growth companies looking to not only build culture, but really drive growth and performance. We're going to explore some strategies for aligning teams with core values. We're going to talk about setting some clear expectations. We're going to talk about creating an environment where individuals feel empowered to take ownership of their roles, really the key things that are really going to drive culture and drive performance. Again, if you're on YouTube, jump over to LinkedIn so you can enter comments and questions. We'll be watching that. Let me introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Eddie Geller. Eddie is an accomplished entrepreneur and visionary leader. He's currently the founder and CEO of SCORE, which is a company based on measuring corporate culture. He has a background in founding multiple companies, including Tiny Beans. Eddie has a proven track record working with technology, communication, and commercialization and leadership. Welcome, Eddie, to the panel.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Appreciate being here. Thanks so much.
Thanks for being here. Next up, we've got David Turner. David is the CEO of Velocity Now, an executive coaching firm based in Denver, Colorado. With over 25 years of C-level leadership experience, David specializes in growth, accountability, and M&A, and he's guided numerous companies through strategic transformations on a global basis. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Bruce. Pleasure to be here.
And finally, I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm an executive coach focused on helping CEOs scale and exit their businesses more efficiently and hopefully with a little less drama. My experience as a founder and coach, I really specialize in strategic planning and growth and achieving sustainable long-term success. So with all that, let's get into our topics and get into our program. I want to start with just kind of a general question for both of you around just kind of how you define company culture. I think this is a term everyone throws around, but kind of practically, like when we talk about company culture, what do you mean, or what do we look at inside organizations? David, why don't we start with you, and then I'll hear from Eddie.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that question of how do you define company culture is something that has been batted around for many years, and I don't know if there's actually a single best definition, but I mean, it is a feeling, right? It is an emotion of the CEO, the executive team, and everybody else that works in the company. You can measure it to a degree, but it's hard to really get a true pulse. But I do think that it starts at the top, and it's driven through consistency, which I think is probably the most important thing, that you are practicing what you preach and are living the values, not just signed in the conference room. But I do think that it is something that is still kind of hard to define on how you tell it, but it is it's a feeling and emotion that can be measured to a certain degree. Of course, with Eddie's, what he does, he measures it. But that's my thought on it.
Thanks. So Eddie, tell me a little bit about how you approach culture. I know you've got a very particular kind of angle on this, and this is the space that you're in right now. But give us your take.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I mean, in my mind, very simply, culture is the environment in which people connect and work together, right? And obviously, we're talking about corporate culture here, right? So when I say connect, whether it's in person, whether it's remote, whether it's a combination, it's how people coordinate things, connect on projects together, how they turn up with their core behaviors. It's a whole range of facets. And just like you called out, through my own personal experience in building teams, and then obviously as part of that, building companies, and through a ton of research, there's really a connection point of like how people connect from core values, like David said, a cohesiveness of connection and common beliefs. And once they're connected, where are we heading as a group of people, as a team? What is the future for us? What is the strategy? Which mountain are we climbing? How fast are we climbing it? I think that's a key part of, how people connect, and the right people to connect at that cultural clarity level. And the other thing is then what happens when there's pitfalls and challenges? That's the whole courage piece of do they lean in or do they run away? When someone falls over, is someone there to pick them up? And again, it's all those aspects of teams that I think, we know so much in all other parts of our lives, like, sports and family and other ways, but it's about how do we apply those concepts to culture in an organization. And I think they're all the same, but I think it's how organizations, and more importantly, CEOs and leadership teams, define that. Because so often I'll hear that, we're family, or we're other sort of aspects of culture, which we all know is so not the case, but it's kind of an easy answer.
Yeah. There's a bunch of things I want to dig in there. I think the thing I would add, I always think of culture as what makes the company different than other companies. And a lot of times what I'm doing with companies when we're talking about growth and scaling is defining a culture, and it's like, what kind of people do you want? Like, who do you want to attract? Like, what kind of people do you want inside the company doing the things that you're doing? And what kind of people do you not, right? And they're not good and bad, right? They're not, it's not about these are good people or bad people, or good employees or bad employees. These are the type of employees that we want to amass and create this way of being and way of operating and kind of joie de vivre inside the organization that is going to create alignment and is going to create kind of synergies. I think about brands, and brands have different kind of attributes that attract certain people and repel other people. Same thing with companies, right? It's about what kind of people are you going to attract. I think one question I wanted to ask, or kind of a topic that I thought would be interesting, is do you see culture as something that's innate or something that is developed, or how much control do you have over this? Is this just something you are and you kind of just accept it? Or can you actually adjust and kind of massage and adopt it or change it in ways based on what you want to do? Eddie, why don't we start with you on that one? Then I'd like to hear David's thoughts.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I love the question, the whole like nature versus nurture, but I think as a CEO, because so much, starts and stops with the CEO, the founder, the entrepreneur, the CEO sort of leads the organization, because it's really their ability to adapt and rethink their approach, because how they turn up and how they lead their people really is going to define extensively their culture. Now, clearly, the larger the organization, the harder it is to really permeate, because in my mind, culture is local. It's not global. You can set all sorts of things on a wall in head office of what the core values are, but it starts up being lived 3 levels down, 10,000 miles away. Frankly, does it matter? So I think so much really depends on the leadership, but also how that's cascaded across organizations through department heads, people leaders, supervisors. And then for me, it's about, is there enough evidence for the CEO and leadership team to rethink their approach of culture and rethink their approach of the way they lead? And I'm a big believer of the right CEO with the right frame of mind who can really build something special has to adapt, has to rethink that. That every year is a new strategy, every year is a new path. Now, is culture a priority every year? No, I wish it was, and it should be, and that's obviously part of my mission to sort of help galvanize. But frankly, I think if we can come together and convince CEOs accordingly that it's in their best interests and their shareholders' best interests to focus on their culture and people, then as a movement, we can then make that change and finally influence the CEO, because it's so hard without that data, and that in the past has just been not present.
Yeah. David, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I am so fortunate and lucky and grateful to work for 2 CEOs in the past, Jerry Stead and Jeff Tarr, who I give all the credit to my work today and everything that I believe in, because they said that we want to be a company that is maniacal about our values. And what that meant was that we literally, and I can say this with confidence because I worked there and I was an executive at these 2 companies, but we want to hire based on our values, fire based on our values, recruit based on our values, pay on our values, reward on our values, and acknowledge on the values, right? People living them or not. And if you do that at a drumbeat cadence, and I mean like 99% consistency, i.e. maniacal about living the values, that does create a culture, because you weed out the people that don't believe in the values, because you fire based on the not living the values, and you hire people based on the values, because those are the questions you ask in the interview process as much as what their experience is. So I know it seems cliche talking about values, but when you work for a company, and I actually led a company that was truly maniacal about our values through a drumbeat cadence, and not just talking about it every once in a while, but it was the beginning of the meetings It was the end of the meetings. It was a beginning of the discussion. It was our compass. It was our GPS. And I think that defined the culture. And it showed up in the culture scores and the engagement scores. And of course, the one company that I started out, that I learned the original concept of maniacal. We went from 320 million and it sold for $44 billion 2 years ago. So you can't argue with that.
A lot of numbers there. A lot of zeros.
A lot of numbers, a lot of shareholder value.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've kind of learned, so most of my work was with these companies that are in this kind of 10 to 100 million range that are in kind of high growth mode. And the way we've kind of approached culture primarily through values is thinking about like a set of DNA that a company has, has a possible set of values. It's not every value, but there's maybe 2 or 3 dozen kind of possible values that you could have based on your kind of underlying DNA. And there's a certain amount of expression or choices that you make based on intention and based on environment that kind of bring certain ones of those out. And one thing that I've kind of found that's been really interesting is based on kind of what strategy we're trying to execute or where we are in the growth process or what sort of priorities we have for a given quarter or for a given year, we can kind of lean on or we can focus on or emphasize certain values to really kind of help us achieve our goals. Now, again, it can't be anything, right? I can't just randomly choose a value. Like I have to have some kind of evidence that we have this capability or this nascent kind of ability to do something, but we can kind of zero in on it. We can say, hey, look, these are the 2 or 3 things, 2 or 3 values that are really going to help us execute on our goals. And I found that's a really interesting way to kind of both accept that, look, we are who we are, but we do have some kind of choice and we can be intentional around this, and we can be intentional around what we're trying to do, like what's going to serve us well. Let's get a little bit more into values, because I think that's a really key part of culture. But how do you each kind of figure out values or discover values or express values? Any kind of tricks or processes or methods that you've seen that a company can kind of understand what their values are, what their potential values are, or how do you get them to the surface? Eddie, I'm curious, what do you use, or what are some techniques that you've seen work?
Well, so I love this topic, Bruce, that's for sure. And just before we start, I guess I shared the how. I just want to comment on the core values in general. I'm very passionate about this, and through learning the hard way, frankly, in my first company, our core values was, I think, like people, integrity, and excellence. Like, what a load of nonsense. Honestly, the amount of companies I meet today, like, our core values is like integrity and honesty, and like, that's table stakes. Like, what you're gonna like, you have to then, put on a wall and recognize honesty. Like, how do you even recognize honesty? Like the whole, I think for decades and still to this day, thousands of companies have this, and I met one last week. And I don't think leaders realize, and to your point, to your question, the core values is a strength, is a strategic opportunity for you to really understand what makes you different and what can make you thrive. I mean, I love Zappos's example. I mean, Zappos built $1 billion company selling online shoes, and one of the core values was delivering happiness. Delivering happiness connected to shoes. So, and you can do it. So just opening CEOs' minds about core values being an absolute strength if done well strategically against typically a red ocean, you could really accelerate your business. So I think core values is a massive opportunity that a lot of CEOs just don't invest the time on. I love, obviously, both of you work with lots of CEOs on this, so they'll probably be getting it right, but so many getting it wrong. In terms of the actual specific question, sorry, I can rant all day with core values, but in terms of the specific question on the how, one technique I've used before, which I think is, again, I'm more focused on like the progress over perfection. I think there's probably a much more comprehensive approach. But one question I often ask leadership teams is that, if you can think of 2 or 3 people top of mind that you just think are rock stars in your mind, like, like they, in your way, they turn up, they're accountable, they do all the things you believe that you believe, can drive a hype that you want on your team, that you would go to bat for. And imagine if you had 100 of these people. What characteristics, what personality traits do they have if you had 100 of these people? And then let's write them up. And typically you'll get a whole bunch of standard ones, but then you may, if you lean in more, you'll get a bunch of unique ones, especially across a broad of like a leadership team. And that typically will find a handful of themes. And I'm always a big believer of trying to get them to 3. Too many are much more than that. but 3 is because it's hard enough to convince or to recognize people in the act of doing one good thing.
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
10 good things. So I'm all about 3, and that's super hard. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of the approach I've used before. And then every year revisit. Do we need to revisit it and change it, or are we good with it? That's the approach I've taken that's worked reasonably well.
Yeah. David, you mentioned the maniacal drumbeat of values. How I guess what's your experience in terms of identifying, discovering, articulating core values inside organizations?
I have to be careful here too, because I've written a book with 36,000 words basically on this topic. So I will not say 36,000 words. I'll say a couple of things. One is I agree with Eddie. Integrity, the old school of integrity, respect, honesty, those don't resonate anymore. So what you have to do, in my opinion, and I do this, every quarter with executive teams. First of all, you have to create time and space to talk and marinate and massage and debate on what the values should be. And then specifically, how do we word the values? I'll give you a couple of examples. Instead of like respect, one of the values that I've come up with in the past is respect and care for all of our customers, all of our vendors, all of our partners, all of our families. So you want to have these values that you can expand on to where it's a more encompassing. Okay, respect what? Respect each other. That's a start, but there's deeper than that. Another example is innovation, right? Which is like very tired. So then what happens when you have innovation is like, oh, that's just the product development team, right? Or the product management. But when you say create a better way, then you move it to every accounting process, every sales process, every way that you run meetings. Create a better way to do everything. And so everybody becomes an innovator of something better. So create the time and space to massage and debate and come up with taking it from integrity to integrity, always. From respect to respect and care for all, right? And so I think that's what is missing with most, is they just don't create the time, i.e. 4, 5, 6 hours or a day in the space. All we're going to talk about is the values. And that when you do that, I just did this for a company 3 weeks ago, the excitement level, it went from we believe that or we think that values are going to be good to I feel the values might be good to I believe that the values are going to be amazing. And that's a big difference between those 3 levels.
Yeah. It's funny. As a strategic coach, I mean, I get so performance focused on this one. That like when I work with teams on core values, I have these kind of 3 things that I kind of check in with them on, or I kind of requirements that I have before they can really kind of decide that something's a core value. One is that it has to be something we've observed before, right? They've got to have some kind of historical demonstration of this kind of behavior, or that this is important to them somehow. It doesn't need to be perfect, doesn't need to be all the time, but they have to be able to point to something. Otherwise, I'm worried that it's aspirational. It's like, okay, we'd like to be like this, but they've never demonstrated this before, right? So they've had to have some amount of demonstration of this in the past. The second thing is it has to help us make a decision, right? Like I want core values that are going to help guide our decision making, because fundamentally, I find core values are a tool to help us decide how we're going to make decisions and how we're going to do that. We're going to go path A, B, and C. If A, B, and C are, all more or less equal to get us to a goal, core values should help us decide that, A is definitely the way, because B and C are not aligned with our core values. But the third one I've started to do, which has been interesting, is they have to show me what the trade-off is. And I use something called an anti-value. They have to show me, well, what is the thing they're willing to give up to live this value? And my test is I have to be able to take that and flip it around and give it to another company and still have it work. So they can't say like honesty. Well, it's like, okay, I don't know. I mean, unless maybe you could take the CIA or something like that and say that they have a value of dishonesty, but I have to be able to take the anti-value that they've chosen, and another company could take that and make that a value, and it's totally valid. And the reason is because I want it to be a trade-off. I want it to be a decision. Like, in order to live this, we're willing to give this up, and this other thing is important, or could be a good way of doing things, but we're choosing to be this way, because I find that really helps give kind of meat to it and understand that they are making a trade-off and they're making a conscious decision to be this way and not that way. And again, to really differentiate themselves culturally from
I'll make a quick example there.
Yeah.
I remember very specifically 10 years ago going into the office of the CEO when I was the CHRO of Digital Globe, the satellite company, and I brought a tens of millions of dollar deal to the table. Not, a couple $100,000, like meaningful for a $700 million company. And I remember I presented it and I'm like, it has this 1% gray area, 1% gray area. And I remember Jeff looking at me, integrity always, we're not doing it. And that was it. And we walked away from a $30 million deal that would have moved our stock price, but he's like integrity. That's what I say, maniacal about the values. It's the big difference, right?
Yeah.
Just another example, actually, on that. If you're familiar with a company called Atlassian, they have collaboration software, Jira. If you haven't heard of it, check them out. Obviously, a very large company globally. And I remember, and actually, I was schooled on this because this would probably be 2003, 2004. So I still had it up on my wall and the people to integrity, excellence, nonsense. But I remember going to their offices because they're an Australian company, and it said, "Don't beep the customer. Like, don't fuck the customer." And this kind of leaned into their culture because that's their culture, but also like that's such a strong statement to every single person in the organization that we're going to do everything not to screw over the customer. Like, it's just so powerful, as opposed to like, we're all about our customers or customer obsession or customer happiness. Like, they're fine, and there's definitely benefit in customer obsession, like I see it, but that's like the next level. And I love that example because it leans into what they're really passionate about. And that's permeated everywhere in every way, around how they sell things, to how they contract, to their policies for, if customers aren't happy, and all the make goods. And I think that's really, again, profound, but really, again, across the fabric of the organization, drive strategy, something as simple as that.
Yeah. And I know Scott and the Atlassian team well, and another one of their values is no a-holes.
Yes.
Which
awesome.
is and that's, listen, one bad apple spoils a bunch. And if you're living the values, if you are toxic or you're not, living the values, you're out.
Yeah.
That's not a decision. I literally remember letting go of a number one performer out of 250 people. I let the number one guy go because he wasn't living the values. And the risk was, why in the world would you let this guy go? Who was producing so much revenue? And instead of me worried about like people coming up to me, you screwed us, they were like, unbelievable. Well done.
100% support. Yeah.
And the other thing I learned on this too is that, the first CEO, I was talking about Jerry Stead, who's been the CEO of like 8 publicly traded companies that I work for. We paid people or didn't pay their bonus based on the assessment of their peers and their managers living the value.
Wow.
Talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
So if you lived the values, you got paid the 15% of your bonus that was associated. If you didn't, you didn't get paid.
I think this whole topic of how do you actually use core values, I think, is fascinating, because I think a lot of companies they'll go through processes to kind of articulate them, and they'll come up with nice statements, and they'll come up with these examples and stuff. But actually, like, what do you use them for? I think these are some great examples of, really, like, who do you choose to work with? Like, what customers do you take on? What customers do you not take on? What people do you hire or fire? Right? Like these become really meaningful and practical tools to make real business decisions on a day-to-day basis. Any other examples of like how to actually apply core values? Because I think that's where a lot of companies struggle.
Well, look, I've got another one. I'm a big fan of the story of Pixar and Steve Jobs. When he was pushed out of Microsoft in the 80s and joined this animation company of, like, what was animation at the time? Obviously, besides Mickey Mouse, etc., reinvented animation, but again, leaned into a certain type of person, a certain, what he quotes, a misfit, right? A certain type of individual that had to lean into the uncommon, the curiosity, the courageousness, the sort of the uncanny ability to think differently. And that's a core, like the type of person, and it's a core value. And again, like, you're almost leaning into the discomfort with the conflict of like having ideas shut down, and leaning into new and still being up for new ideas. Like, that is a very unique environment that only a certain amount of people can really operate in. And then frankly, a certain amount of people can be successful in. So that's another big one for me. I've got loads of them, but I'm a big fan of that. And obviously we know the story what happened to Pixar and Apple and Steve Jobs, but again, it's another way of how they use the core values to drive strategic advantage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say that this may be, I have a saying that I created years ago, and then as I've seen it play out in truth through 11,000 hours of coaching C-level executives, I keep saying it. Although today might not be the best time to say it, but the saying is relationships and values trump results. But that assumes that one of your values is results. And the one I always used was results matter. So, the problem with values with a lot of CEOs and executives, like, it's too soft, right? It means if we're just being nice to each other, respectful, we're not performing. No, one of the values, and I actually always had it as the last value on purpose, start with integrity, you end with results. Results matter. So if you don't think the results matter, and you're going to just be nice and live the values, then you're not living all the values. So you're out. But relationships and values trump results, assuming that one of your values, because you got to live it, is results matter.
Anything in terms of like hiring, because I think there's a lot of people struggle with that. They're pretty good at like skills and experience and things like that. But in terms of evaluating kind of cultural fit and value fit, any kind of techniques or tools that you've seen companies use to help evaluate candidates in the hiring process around this?
Yeah, I'll start on that one. I'll tell you in the form of a story. When I was the CEO of the last private equity company, I was interviewing for CROs, and I narrowed it down to 3 candidates, and I was about to start my interview process. And I only do 30 minutes for the first interview. And the reason why is the very first question I ask is, just tell me about your leadership philosophy. That's it. Not really. And if they don't say in the first 30 seconds of that answer something about servant leadership, or people are the only sustainable differentiator, or values maniacal about that, they don't say some flavor of that, and they start with, well, I have done this, or I did this, or here's my experience, then I don't have to follow up with another interview. And so I remember very specifically, I had 3 CROs. The 2 were way more qualified from their experience. The third one a little less qualified, but he just went into a whole thing about values and people being a sustainable, and here's how I coach people and develop people. And that was his answer. He never said, I do this or I did this. Well, I hired him and he crushed it. Big difference. And so that's one way I filter and coach my my coachees to filter through, like use their pressure. Because if you ask somebody, tell me about values, they'll be like, oh, I do this or that. Tell me about how, I love to empower people. But if it's not really core to their philosophy in those first 30 seconds, that's not really who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your take on this?
Yeah, I love that. So I think the evaluation process of candidates is I use the entire process, because you clearly have some time with them one-on-one. You can ask them questions around, behaviors. And for example, one of ours is growth mindset. Tell me what your growth mindset means to you. How's that turned up to you in previous jobs, etc. But what I find interesting is I learn I wouldn't say the most, a lot in between the interviews. What happens when I got off the call? What happened prior to the call? What happened on a second call if we got to that stage? And I think I've qualified candidates out half the time because of the in-between stuff. Like, how did they respond to me when I reached out? Like all that stuff that leans into all sorts of, triggers and messages that drive the core values in terms of like how they're going to be with customers. And the other thing I've always found is I think about building a team. Would I want to go to bat or to war or to battle with this person? Could I hang out with them and grab a drink with them and want to hang out with them? And I think that's also part of it. Like, of course, I don't want to have to be best friends with them. But again, I've always believed that teams that sweat together, eat together, win together. And that obviously is core values at the center of it. But there's also other things that you want to be able to connect. And it's about bringing those right people together and leveraging their strengths, which is a whole nother topic. But do we turn up in the same way? So for me, it's a whole process. And people go to the presentation stage, and I've qualified them out because of certain things that they said or didn't say all the way through. So all different approaches.
Yeah, we've with a couple of companies, we've used this kind of value anti-value pair to kind of set up these kind of questions or scenarios, and then let the candidates kind of kind of indicate like, well, which end of the spectrum would they be on? And because they're both good, they're kind of naturally leaning towards one to the other. And then we can kind of tell like, okay, it's like, which is better aligned with who we are as a company. And it's subtle, but I find that it helps where do you have alignment, but also helps figure out, okay, where are we going to potentially have conflict, right? Like we may not have great alignment, but we don't want someone who's going to be clearly on the other end of this, because we're going to create a lot of conflict inside the organization. So yeah, it's a challenging one. I think companies are looking for all sorts of kind of solutions and strategies for doing this, both for creating and then implementing values. And we are at time already. I know these go by very quickly. So I want to make sure that if people want to get more information from either of you, David, if people want to get contact information or look you up, what's the best way to get that?
Yeah, just David at velocitynowllc.com.
Awesome. Great. And Eddie?
Yeah, you can look me up on LinkedIn, Eddie Geller, or on email, eddie@cultureskor.com anytime as well.
Perfect. And you can reach me at my email is just bruce@eckfeldt.com. My website is eckfeldt.com. And then obviously on LinkedIn as well. So David, Eddie, thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everyone who's been listening here and who's listening to the replay. I'll post some information, contact information, things like that on the LinkedIn side. So check that out and really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, David.